In 1075, England's castles were rising. The families beneath them were not. Living beneath them weren't protected by those walls. They were owned by them. 500 Norman fortresses had been hammered into English soil in less than 10 years. Beneath those towers, in the undercrofts and basement chambers, entire families lived and worked, not as guests, as instruments. The stone above them wasn't shelter. It was the weight of a system built to squeeze labor, loyalty, and life itself from anyone trapped inside its shadow. Their names were never written down. No one recorded their deaths. And for nearly 1,000 years, historians treated that silence as absence, as if they had simply never existed. But they did exist. And the reason we know this is almost cruel in its irony. 11 years after 1075, William the Conqueror commissioned the Domesday Book, the most exhaustive census medieval Europe had ever seen. It counted land, livestock, and labor with surgical precision. And buried inside its columns, it named them boarders, serfs, castle-bound workers ranked below the threshold of legal personhood, not people, line items. The categorization was policy. It was policy. Erasure was the point. And yet, the system that erased them kept perfect records of what it extracted from them. The traces are still there, measurable and recoverable. That is exactly what we are reconstructing today. We are going to spend the next 15 minutes inside a single day. One family, one undercroft, 24 hours in 1075, reconstructed hour by hour from what survives. Bone chemistry, pollen records, manorial account rolls, architectural remains. We begin before dawn, when cold was not discomfort, but danger. We move through the morning labor summons, the midday meal that was never enough, the afternoon when fear had a schedule. We end at the fire, where survival was a communal act, not a private one. Each segment follows the same structure, what they experienced, what it cost them, and what the castle extracted in return. Imagine waking up and not being able to see your own hand. Not dim light. Not shadows. Actual darkness. The kind that presses against your eyes like fabric. That was the undercroft at dawn. Every morning. Every single one. The space itself was not large. Stone barrel vaults curved overhead at roughly 2.5 meters at the peak. Enough to stand, barely enough to breathe freely. The walls were rubble-core limestone, mortared with lime and aggregate, sweating cold in every season. The floor was either packed earth or rough flagstone, and neither offered insulation from the ground beneath. In winter, the cold came up through your feet before it came down through the air. There was no window at ground level. This was not an oversight. Openings compromised the structural load-bearing capacity of the vault. Yes, but they also would have given occupants something Norman builders had no interest in giving them: awareness of the outside world, light by which to measure time, and air that did not carry the smell of the waste channels running through the same ventilation shafts meant to clear the room. That smell, mold, animal fat, human waste, damp grain, was permanent, embedded in the stone itself. Archaeology confirms it. Chemical residue analysis from undercroft excavations at sites like Castle Acre and Richmond shows layered organic deposits, suggesting continuous habitation over decades. The space was built for grain and barrels. The people came second, and the design remembered that. What does 30 years on damp stone do to a body? Stone for 30 years? Not metaphorically, physically. Bone by bone. Before the bell. Before the animals need feeding. Before whoever holds the lease on your labor decides what shape your day takes. There is a moment, maybe 3 seconds long, when a man in that undercroft is just a body trying to become vertical. And those 3 seconds tell you everything. The spine goes first. Not suddenly. Not from one injury, but slowly, Across years, the vertebrae compress under loads that never stop. Archaeologists reading the skeletal record from 11th century lower-class burials in England find the same signatures again and again. Osteophyte formations, bone spurs along the lumbar spine, erosion in the knee joints, joint degradation in the hands, starting in the late 20s. These are not old-age findings. These are working-age findings. The average man in that room stood around 168 centimeters. Not because the genetics demanded it, because the food did not come in sufficient quantity across enough consecutive years to build anything taller. Chronic nutritional deficiency written into the skeleton across generations. So he wakes. The cold is not dramatic. The floor, walls, and air all share the same temperature. Everything the same. He takes inventory of himself the way people do when movement costs something. And then, he has to stand up anyway. Before this family could feed themselves, they owed the castle something. How much? And what happened if they couldn't deliver? 2 to 4 days. Every week. That was the baseline extraction under Norman feudal custom. Corvée labor, unpaid work owed directly to the lord. Castle maintenance, garrison support, working the domain lands that belonged to the estate itself. This wasn't negotiable. This was not seasonal. This was structural, and it came first. Before the family's own fields, before their own harvest, before anything that might keep them alive through winter. The castle's claim preceded survival. There was a man whose job was to make sure this happened. The reeve, an overseer drawn from the dependent population itself, positioned between the lord's interests and his neighbor's desperation. He kept records. He noted who showed up and who did not. He tracked defaults. If you could not work your corvée days, injury, illness, no one left in the household capable of the labor, you did not get a pass. You got a fine, paid in kind. Grain, livestock, tools, whatever the household had that could be converted into value and transferred upward. So the man in that basement stands, not because rest is complete, because the obligation structure has started its claim on his body, and delay compounds the cost. What was on that table? First, was there even a table? Archaeology gives us a partial answer, and it is not generous. The lowest castle-dependent households in 1075 England did not sit down to meals the way we understand meals. A shared surface, maybe. A board laid across trestles, pulled out and put away. Nothing permanent. Nothing that suggested eating was an occasion rather than a maintenance task. What they ate was maslin bread. Rye and wheat mixed together because pure wheat was too valuable to consume, and rye alone too bitter to stomach. Dense, dark, slow to digest, the kind of bread that sits in the body like ballast. Beside it, pottage, dried peas, dried beans, whatever green thing could be foraged from the margin of a field or the edge of a wood. Cooked long and low in a shared pot, often in the undercroft itself, where the stone held a consistent cold, and smoke had nowhere easy to escape. It smelled of wet grain and iron. Salt fish appeared in the diet, not as variety, but as the only preserved protein available to people who did not butcher their own animals. Meat, actual meat, arrived perhaps 4 to 6 times a year. Feast days, obligation feasts that the Lord staged, partly to remind everyone who controlled the surplus. Small beer was safer than water. Children drank it. This is not poverty as absence. This is poverty as precision, a diet calibrated to keep a body functional enough to work, and no more. And then there were the children. Norman England had no legal word for childhood as protection, no category that shielded a small body from the economy pressing down on it. A serf's child was a serf. A boarder's child was a boardar. The system did not wait. By age 5 or 6, they were working, not helping, not learning. Working in the scullery, hauling fuel bundles, tending animals whose value to the Lord exceeded their own. The castle recorded their labor the same way it recorded a broken cart axle or a depleted grain store, as a unit of resource to be used. Mortality was not an abstraction in these households. It was the texture of ordinary life. A significant portion of children born into dependent castle households did not survive to adolescence. Illness, cold, the accumulated weight of a body that never had quite enough. These were not misfortunes. They were outcomes that the system had, in effect, already priced in. Here is the thing that becomes hard to think about directly. The parents knew this. They understood what their child was inside this structure. Not a future, not a protected life. A small laboring unit attached to a larger laboring unit, both of them owned by the same cold stone logic. What does a parent do with that knowledge? Where does that go in a life with no private grief, no legal recourse, and nowhere to put it except forward into the next morning's work? Everything we've seen so far was the structure. Now we go smaller, down to the objects. Because among the broken pottery and rusted tools archaeologists find in Norman undercrofts, there is a different category of object. Small carved wooden tokens, knotted lengths of cord. Stones that have been rubbed smooth by years of handling. No exchange value. No use in trade. Too small to matter to a lord's inventory. These were the only things a serf could own that the system didn't have a legal claim to. The only possessions that were actually theirs. And what strikes you, when you see these objects cataloged in museum archives, is how deliberate they are. Someone spent time on them, carved a face into wood they weren't supposed to have time to carve, tied knots in a pattern that meant something to no one but them. These families protected these objects, hid them, passed them down. In a life where everything else could be taken, these were the things they chose to keep close. Think about what it means to never fully rest. Not because you're tired, though you are, always, but because rest itself is evidence. A still body in the middle of the afternoon is a body that isn't working, and someone is always watching for that. The reeve came without announcement. That was the point. He wasn't a knight, wasn't nobility. He was often a man from the same village, sometimes a serf himself, elevated just enough to be useful to the lord above and dangerous to everyone below. He kept records. He noted who was slow, who looked up at the wrong moment, whose grain pile seemed lighter than it should. And you knew this. Every person in that village knew this. So you learned to perform labor even when you were exhausted. You learned to position your body correctly, to keep your face neutral, to make your hands move even when your hands had nothing useful to do. You learned the specific discipline of looking productive under observation. Psychologists today have a name for what happens to people who live inside constant surveillance. The self begins to splinter. You develop a version of yourself for watching eyes, and another, smaller version that you keep hidden. These families were doing that 800 years before anyone had the language for it. And the cruelest part? The reeve was also watched, also recorded, also performing. The system didn't trust anyone. But the Lord's eyes did eventually turn away. Night came, the fire stayed, and people turned toward each other in that undercroft when the surveillance lifted, even briefly, even partially. People turned toward each other. The hearth was never just heat. In a space where Norman French ran the world above, the fire below was where English survived. Not the formal English of documents, the real one. The one that carried jokes and warnings and the names of the dead. Someone would have sung, not for entertainment in any modern sense. Singing was how you held information in a body before paper was available to you. A melody was a memory system. Stories moved around that fire that the Lord would never hear. Genealogies spoken aloud. Grievances passed in code. Children absorbing language their parents couldn't protect in any other way. Here is the remarkable thing about oral cultures under pressure. They don't disappear easily. They go underground. They get denser. The stories become more load-bearing because they have to carry what writing cannot be trusted to carry. What was spoken in those undercrofts in 1075 left almost no trace in the record. The Reeves ledger noted bushels and labor days. It did not note what the woman near the fire said to make everyone laugh before sleep. But she said something. That much is certain. And someone remembered it. The castle was not just a fortress, it was a machine. And the undercroft was the engine room. This is what we miss when we imagine medieval life through the filter of stone and banners. The Norman castle in 1075 was designed, architecturally, legally, administratively, to extract labor from people who had no way out. Food preparation happened below. Fuel storage happened below. Maintenance, garrison support, the endless cycle of feeding and repairing the structure above. All of it required bodies that the system refused to name. These families were not guests. They were not even servants in the way we understand that word. They were structurally necessary and legally invisible. The Reeve could record their output. He could not record their refusal because refusal was not architecturally possible. This is the specific horror. Not that they were poor, not that they worked hard, but that the system required them completely while denying them any form of recognition that might imply obligation in return. The undercroft was not incidental. It was the condition of the castle's power. And the reason we are only now reconstructing who these people were, piecing together names from marginal notes, dialects from loan words, lives from the accidents of archaeology, is that the design worked exactly as intended. They were supposed to vanish. And for 900 years they did. But that design did not die with the Normans. The same logic: extract the labor, deny the personhood, engineer the disappearance from the record, reappears with a chilling consistency across centuries. The plantation ledger that lists a human being as inventory. The factory payroll that records a body and a wage, but never a name you could trace. The census column left blank because the enumerator did not consider the question worth asking. Different stone, the same basement, and here is what makes the reconstruction of these 11th century lives something more than scholarship. Every time a historian pulls a name from a marginal gloss, or reads a borrowed word as evidence of a community, or follows a post hole into the outline of a life, that act is a refusal. A refusal to let the original erasure stand as the final word. Nostalgia looks backward to mourn what was comfortable. Justice looks backward to correct what was deliberate. These families were made invisible by design, not by accident, not by neglect. Remembering them clearly, precisely, without sentiment. That is the work that finally costs the system something. The floor above, the kitchen level, was run by a different category of worker. Not quite free, not quite enslaved, but operating under a different contract with the same lord. The architecture tells you exactly how finely the system was tuned, how each degree of dependency was housed, fed, and watched. That reconstruction is next, not because it completes the picture, but because it sharpens the question. How many gradations of unfreedom can one building hold? And if you're ready to see that calibration mapped in stone and ash and bone,